The HOA utility truck backed through my ranch gate at 6:04 in the morning. Its reverse alarm cut through the fog while two workers lifted bolt cutters toward the fenced transformer station sitting inside my newly inherited 2,700 acres. Diane Mercer stood beside them in a charcoal coat, pointing at the gate like she owned the ground under it. Behind that fence, the main power feed for Cedar Hollow Estates hummed loud enough to vibrate in my boots. Streetlights, security cameras, clubhouse refrigeration, pool pumps, gate systems, and every house on the ridge depended on that corridor. What Diane did not understand was simple. I controlled the utility access road, the fenced transformer pad, and the power line easement crossing my ranch. The bolt cutters snapped shut before I reached them. Steel rang against steel. The transformer gave off that dry electric buzz that makes the air feel sharp. Damp grass brushed my jeans as I crossed the clearing. One worker froze with the cut chain in his hand. The other looked back at Diane. She did not blink. That was her first mistake. People who are right usually bring paperwork before bolt cutters. I stopped 10 feet from the gate and looked at the fresh tire tracks carved into my service road. Red clay stuck to their truck tires. The smell of diesel mixed with wet cedar. A yellow warning sign on the fence read high voltage, authorized personnel only. Someone had zip-tied a laminated HOA notice beneath it. Cedar Hollow Utility Access Zone. That sign had not been there yesterday. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 44 years old, and 3 weeks earlier I inherited this ranch from my uncle. I knew cattle leases. I knew fences. I knew land records well enough to read them twice. What I did not know, until that morning, was why an HOA thought it could walk into my property and service an electrical corridor without asking. Diane stepped forward with her phone in one hand and a folder in the other. She was 56, polished, and calm in that suburban boardroom way that makes threats sound like procedures. Her white SUV sat near the gate with its flashers blinking. Behind her, a Cedar Hollow security guard leaned against a golf cart like this was routine. "Mr. Walker," she said, "this access point serves our community. We have maintained it for years." I looked at the broken chain again. Not this morning. Her smile tightened. The fog drifted between us. Somewhere beyond the ridge, porch lights flickered across Cedar Hollow Estates as the sun started climbing. Hundreds of homes sat just past my northern fence line. From where we stood, I could see the power poles marching across my pasture toward them. Tall wooden structures, weathered crossarms, wires humming above open grass. They looked ordinary until you realized every one of them crossed private land. Diane opened her folder and pulled out a photocopied map. The edges were curled. A thick yellow line ran across my ranch. "This easement predates your ownership," she said. "You cannot interfere." I took the page, but did not answer right away. The map showed the corridor, but not the transformer pad fence, not the service road, not the maintenance gate, and not the brass survey marker half buried beside the concrete base. That marker carried my family name. The worker with the bolt cutters shifted his weight. The chain dangled from his hand. I heard the transformer hum harder, or maybe the silence around it made the sound feel louder. Diane kept talking about community reliance and utility continuity. I kept staring at the survey marker. Then I noticed the date stamped into the concrete pad. The date stamped into the concrete pad was newer than the date on Diane's map. I crouched beside the transformer fence and brushed dirt away with my hand. Moist soil stuck beneath my fingernails. The metal surface felt cold from the morning fog. The workers watched without speaking. Diane folded her arms. The hum from the equipment filled the silence. The numbers became clearer as the dirt fell away. The pad had been expanded years after the document she carried was created. That caught my attention immediately. I stood and handed the photocopy back to her. "Do you have anything newer?" I asked. Diane's expression barely changed. "This is the document we have always used." That answer landed harder than she intended. Always used was not the same thing as correct. A hawk circled above the pasture. The wind pushed through the utility corridor and rattled the warning signs on the fence. Something about the entire scene felt rehearsed. The workers clearly expected access. The security guard looked bored. Diane sounded certain. Yet nobody seemed interested in the date sitting right in front of them. That detail stayed with me. I walked along the fence line. Wet grass brushed against my boots. A row of weathered utility poles stretched north towards Cedar Hollow Estates. The poles crossed open pasture, dipped into a creek bed, then disappeared beyond a line of cedar trees. I followed them with my eyes until they vanished. Every wire pointed toward the community. Every connection seemed to begin here. Diane continued talking behind me. She mentioned continuity. She mentioned maintenance. She mentioned community obligations. She never mentioned ownership. That omission felt important. A mini excavator sat near the service road entrance. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud beside it. I stopped and looked at them. They were recent. Very recent. Someone had been working around the corridor before sunrise. Who authorized equipment on my property? I asked. Diane hesitated for half a second. It was brief, but I noticed it. Then she said a contractor had inspected vegetation near the lines. Her answer raised a second question. Contractors leave paperwork. I asked for it. She said she would send it later. Another answer without a document attached to it. The sun climbed higher. The fog began to thin. More of the corridor came into view. Near the transformer fence, I noticed a brass survey marker set into concrete. It matched the one carrying my family name. I knelt again and wiped the surface clean. Coordinates were engraved into the metal. Nearby, partially hidden by weeds, stood an older wooden stake with faded orange paint. Someone had tried to mow around it. My pulse picked up slightly. Survey markers do not appear by accident. They exist because boundaries matter. I pulled out my phone and photographed everything. The fence, the transformer, the coordinates, the poles, the service road. Diane watched from a distance. For the first time that morning, she seemed less confident. Not worried. Not yet. Just aware that I was paying attention to details she preferred to ignore. When I finally headed back toward my truck, the smell of wet cedar still hung in the air. The transformer continued humming behind me. The workers never touched the gate again. Then I noticed where the nearest survey line pointed. The nearest survey line pointed directly toward the creek crossing at the northern edge of the ranch. By late afternoon, I was following it in my truck. Gravel cracked beneath the tires. Dust drifted behind me in long golden ribbons. The utility poles stayed in sight almost the entire way. They crossed pasture, climbed low hills, and cut through cedar groves that had stood there longer than most people in Cedar Hollow had been alive. Every few hundred yards, another survey marker appeared. Some were easy to spot. Others were nearly hidden beneath grass and brush. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The corridor followed a carefully documented route. That route mattered. I stopped near the creek and stepped out into the warm air. Water moved quietly beneath a concrete crossing. The smell of damp earth mixed with cedar and sun-baked stone. A metal utility cabinet sat nearby. It was locked. A faded identification plate was attached to the side. Most people would have walked right past it. I did not. The number stamped into the plate matched part of the coordinate sequence I had photographed that morning. That was the first real connection. I took another photo. Then another. A few minutes later, I climbed back into the truck and headed toward the county records office. The building sat 30 miles away in a small town surrounded by grain silos and feed stores. The air conditioning hummed above rows of filing cabinets. Old paper carried that dry scent every records room seems to have. A clerk helped me locate historical survey maps connected to the ranch. I spread them across a large table beneath bright fluorescent lights. The original ranch boundaries appeared exactly where I expected. The utility corridor appeared too. Then I found something interesting. The corridor was labeled differently on older maps than on newer copies. That difference was only a few words, but it caught my attention immediately. Words matter when property is involved, especially old words. I requested additional files. The clerk disappeared into a back room. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying a thick folder secured with a faded ribbon. Dust rose from the cover when she set it down. Several pages contained engineering sketches. Others contained correspondence between surveyors and utility representatives. I turned pages slowly. Most of it was routine. Measurements, notes, maintenance references. Then a single document stopped me cold. It described access rights, not ownership. Access rights. I read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. Outside, the sun dipped lower toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the courthouse lawn. I photographed the page and saved every image twice. My phone vibrated before I could continue. Diane Mercer. I let the call ring for a moment before answering. Her voice remained calm. Too calm. She asked whether I had reconsidered granting unrestricted access through the ranch. I asked whether she had found the contractor paperwork from that morning. A short silence followed. Not long, just long enough to notice. Then she said her legal team would be reviewing everything soon. That answer told me more than she intended. People with clear authority rarely delay simple documents. After the call ended, I returned to the folder. Near the back, I found a folded survey sheet tucked between two unrelated records. Someone had handwritten a note along the margin decades earlier. The note referenced an easement revision I had not seen before. I unfolded the next page and stared at the heading. The heading read Easement Revision Addendum. I stared at it for several seconds before turning the page. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed softly. The courthouse was nearly empty now. Somewhere down the hall a door closed and echoed through the building. I leaned closer to the document. The language was precise. The utility company retained maintenance rights across the corridor. Access rights were clearly defined. Inspection rights were clearly defined. Emergency response rights were clearly defined. One thing was noticeably absent. There was no transfer of ownership. I read the paragraph again. Then I checked the date. The revision had been recorded years after the original easement. That mattered. A lot. My phone screen reflected against the paper as I photographed every page. The clerk glanced over from her desk, but said nothing. I kept reading. Several attached sketches showed utility poles, service routes, and maintenance access points. The transformer station appeared on one drawing. So did the service road. A handwritten notation pointed directly to the fenced area Diane claimed her HOA controlled. The note referenced utility use only. Not HOA use. Not community ownership. Utility use only. I sat back in my chair and listened to the quiet hum of the building. The pieces were beginning to connect. Outside, the last sunlight faded behind the grain silos. I requested copies of the entire file. While the clerk prepared them, I spread the maps across the table one more time. The corridor cut through my ranch like a spine. Every major utility line serving Cedar Hollow appeared linked to it. Every page seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Yet something still bothered me. The revision referenced an engineering update completed several years later. I had not seen those engineering records anywhere in the file. Missing records create questions. Questions create leverage. 20 minutes later, I walked outside carrying a thick envelope under my arm. Warm evening air replaced the recycled courthouse air. Crickets had already started singing from the grass along the parking lot. The drive back to the ranch took nearly an hour. Darkness settled across the hills. Headlights swept over fence posts and cattle guards. Utility poles appeared and disappeared beside the road like silent markers guiding me home. When I reached the ranch house, the porch light glowed against the darkness. I carried the records inside and spread everything across the dining table. Maps covered one end. Survey photos covered the other. The easement revision sat in the center. Coffee steamed beside my laptop. I entered the coordinates from the survey marker into a mapping program. The screen loaded slowly. Then a satellite image appeared. The corridor became visible from above. My eyes followed it north, then east, then directly into Cedar Hollow Estates. The image revealed more than I expected. The transformer station was not isolated infrastructure. It was a central connection point. Streetlights branched from it. Security systems branched from it. Community facilities branched from it. The deeper I looked, the larger the picture became. Around 9 that evening, an email arrived from Diane. The subject line was short. Formal notice. Attached was a letter from an attorney representing the HOA. The language sounded confident. It demanded uninterrupted access. It referenced long-standing practice. It referenced community necessity. It referenced authority. What it did not include was a single updated easement document. I noticed that immediately. I printed the letter and placed it beside the revision addendum. Side by side, the difference felt impossible to ignore. One relied on assumptions. The other relied on recorded documents. The house was completely silent except for the ticking clock above the fireplace. Then another detail caught my eye. Near the bottom of the addendum was a reference number connected to a utility engineering report I had never seen before. The reference number sat at the bottom of the page like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. I copied it into my notebook before going to bed. The house was quiet. Wind moved softly through the oak trees outside. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called across the pasture. I barely slept. By sunrise I was already on the phone with the utility company. The woman who answered transferred me twice before I reached someone in engineering records. The report number meant nothing to him at first. Then his keyboard stopped clicking. A brief silence followed. He asked me to repeat the number. I did. More typing. More silence. Finally, he told me the report existed, but the file had been archived years ago. That was enough for me. Archived meant real. Archived meant documented. Archived meant someone had created a record worth preserving. He could not send it immediately. The request would need approval. I thanked him and hung up. Less than an hour later, another email from Diane arrived. This one was less polite than the first. The attorney letter had been replaced by stronger language. Deadlines. Demands. References to community disruption. The tone had changed. That interested me. Confident people usually become more aggressive when certainty begins slipping away. I printed the email and added it to the growing stack on my dining table. Maps. Surveys. Easements. Utility notes. Photographs. Every document seemed connected now. The puzzle was larger than I originally believed. Around noon, I drove back to the corridor. The air was hot. Grasshoppers jumped through the weeds along the service road. The transformer station hummed steadily behind its fence. This time I continued past it. I wanted to follow the line farther. Utility poles stretched across the ranch like a trail of breadcrumbs. I stopped at every marker I could find. Some carried survey numbers. Others carried faded inspection tags attached to the poles themselves. I photographed each one. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. The corridor was not simply crossing the ranch. It was structured around it. Every major connection point seemed positioned according to the property boundaries established decades earlier. Late in the afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identified himself as Martin Reyes, a regional utility engineer. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who spent his career solving technical problems rather than political ones. He had reviewed my inquiry. He wanted to visit the ranch. That caught my attention immediately. Engineers do not drive hours to inspect facilities without a reason. We arranged a meeting for the following morning. After the call ended, I stood beside one of the larger poles near the northern ridge. Wind pushed gently through the wires overhead. They produced a faint sound, almost like distant music. From that vantage point, I could see Cedar Hollow estates spread across the horizon. Rows of roofs reflected sunlight. The clubhouse stood near the center. Streets curved through the neighborhood like veins. Everything looked peaceful from a distance. Yet every home depended on infrastructure running through the land beneath my feet. That fact felt larger every day. As evening approached, another detail surfaced. One of the photographs I had taken near the transformer station showed a metal inspection plate I had overlooked. After zooming in, I noticed a company stamp and a maintenance designation. The designation did not match the description used in Diane's attorney letter. Not even close. I enlarged the image again and stared at the screen. Then I saw the date beside the designation. The date on the inspection plate was 8 years newer than the date referenced in Diane's attorney letter. I zoomed in again to make sure I was reading it correctly. The numbers did not change. The designation did not change. The document in her email described one thing. The equipment itself described another. Morning arrived before I stopped reviewing photographs. A pale orange glow spread across the eastern horizon as I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee. Cool air carried the scent of cedar and fresh grass. The ranch was quiet except for distant birds and the occasional low call from cattle beyond the tree line. At exactly 8 o'clock, a white utility truck rolled through the front gate. Martin Reyes stepped out carrying a hard hat, a tablet, and a weathered leather folder. He looked like a man who spent more time around equipment than conference tables. We shook hands. Then we headed straight toward the corridor. The truck bounced along the gravel service road while dust drifted behind us. Martin spent most of the drive studying maps on his tablet. Occasionally, he glanced out the window toward the poles. His expression stayed neutral. That made it impossible to guess what he was thinking. When we reached the transformer station, he walked the perimeter slowly. He checked identification plates. He photographed markers. He compared coordinates against his tablet. The transformer hummed steadily behind the fence. Wind moved through the wires overhead. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then Martin crouched beside the survey marker carrying my family name. He brushed dirt away with the edge of his glove. His eyes narrowed slightly. That small reaction caught my attention. He entered something into the tablet. A few moments later, he walked to the maintenance gate and inspected a second marker mounted near the hinge assembly. More notes. More photographs. More silence. Finally, he stood and looked toward the utility poles stretching north. "How far have you followed the corridor?" he asked. I pointed toward the ridge. "Every marker I could find." He nodded slowly. Then we spent the next 2 hours driving the entire route. The farther we went, the more detailed his inspection became. At several locations, he stopped to verify coordinates. At others, he compared engineering references against physical infrastructure. The process felt methodical, professional, important. Near the creek crossing, he examined the utility cabinet I had photographed earlier. He opened a maintenance panel using a company key. Inside were inspection records, service logs, and identification numbers. One number immediately matched the archived report reference I had found in the courthouse records. Martin noticed it too. He photographed the panel before closing it carefully. The morning sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered above the pasture. We stopped for lunch beneath a cluster of oak trees overlooking Cedar Hollow estates. From there, the entire community was visible. Streets curved through the neighborhood. Clubhouse roofs reflected sunlight. Cars moved through the gates. Everything appeared peaceful. Martin studied the view for a long moment. "That is a lot of infrastructure," he said quietly. It was the first opinion he had offered all day. After lunch, we continued toward the northern boundary. Near one of the larger distribution poles, Martin stopped abruptly. He climbed out of the truck and walked directly to a metal identification tag mounted near eye level. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. He compared the tag against something on his tablet. Then he checked it again. The breeze rustled through the grass around us. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he turned toward me. "There is something here I was not expecting to find." Then he showed me the screen. The screen displayed a network map I had never seen before. Sunlight reflected across the tablet as Martin zoomed in on the corridor. Colored lines spread across the display like branches from a tree. Distribution feeds, service routes, control points, backup connections. Every line seemed to lead back to the infrastructure running through my ranch. Wind pushed through the grass around us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Martin tapped one section near the transformer station, then another near the creek crossing, then a third beside the northern ridge. The pattern became impossible to miss. "These are primary feeds," he said. His voice remained calm, but the words carried weight. I looked back toward Cedar Hollow estates in the distance. The neighborhood seemed peaceful from where we stood. Children probably rode bicycles along those streets. Families probably sat down for dinner every evening without giving a second thought to where their electricity originated. Yet the map suggested something much larger than a simple easement dispute. Martin zoomed out again. More lines appeared. The screen now showed the entire service layout connected to the community. Clubhouse systems, security gates, street lighting, irrigation controllers, common area facilities. Layer after layer appeared. My eyes moved across the display. Almost everything flowed through the same corridor. A faint whistle drifted from the wires overhead. Martin looked at me. "I need to verify a few things before making conclusions." That was not a confirmation, but it was not a denial either. We returned to the truck and continued the inspection. The afternoon heat settled heavily across the pasture. Grass shimmered beneath the sun. Every stop seemed to produce another detail, another coordinate, another equipment identifier, another maintenance reference. Near one distribution pole, Martin found a service tag that matched a number referenced in the archived engineering report. Near another, he located an inspection marker linked to the revised easement documentation. The deeper we went, the more the records aligned with the physical infrastructure. That mattered. Documents can be challenged. Physical evidence is harder to ignore. By late afternoon, we arrived back at the transformer station. Martin sat inside the truck reviewing notes. The engine was off. The only sounds came from insects in the grass and the steady electrical hum beyond the fence. Finally, he closed the tablet. "I can tell you one thing now," he said. I waited. "The corridor is far more important than anyone represented in those attorney letters." He did not need to say more. The implication was obvious. Before leaving, Martin requested copies of everything I had gathered. Survey photographs, easement revisions, inspection plate images, historical records. I promised to send them that evening. We shook hands. Then he drove away in a cloud of dust. I watched the utility truck disappear down the ranch road. The silence afterward felt different. He had not delivered a final answer, but he had confirmed that the questions were real. Back at the ranch house, I spent hours organizing files. The dining table had become a command center. Maps overlapped engineering sketches. Photographs set beside legal correspondence. Every document seemed connected now. As darkness settled outside, my email inbox began filling with messages from Cedar Hollow residents. Someone had apparently mentioned the inspection. Word traveled fast in communities like that. Some messages were polite. Others were cautious. A few asked direct questions about the corridor. One resident attached a photograph from a recent HOA meeting. Diane stood beside a presentation board discussing future neighborhood expansion. I zoomed in on the image. Behind her was a map. The same corridor appeared on it. Yet the labeling was different from every utility document I had found. That discrepancy immediately caught my attention. I stared at the screen while the house remained completely quiet around me. Then another email arrived from an unfamiliar address. The email arrived at 9:17 that night. The sender was listed only as a Cedar Hollow resident. No signature, no introduction, just a single attachment and one sentence. You should compare this to the maps from the utility company. I opened the file immediately. The glow from the laptop screen lit the dining room while darkness pressed against the windows outside. Wind tapped a loose branch against the porch roof. The attachment was a photograph taken during an HOA planning session. Someone had clearly snapped it from the back of a meeting room. Diane stood near a projection screen. Behind her was a large development map. I zoomed in. Then I zoomed in again. My pulse picked up slightly. The corridor running through my ranch was visible. The transformer station was visible. Several distribution routes were visible. Yet the labels were completely different from the utility engineering maps Martin had shown me. On the HOA version, the corridor appeared under a designation that implied direct community control. On every utility document I had collected, the corridor was identified as company infrastructure operating under documented access rights. That difference was not small. It was the center of the entire dispute. I saved copies of both maps side by side and studied them for nearly an hour. Every time I compared them, the discrepancy became harder to explain. Near midnight, another detail emerged. One section of the HOA map contained a shaded expansion area extending beyond Cedar Hollow's existing boundary. The proposed expansion crossed directly toward the utility corridor. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Suddenly, several things started making sense. The pressure, the attorney letters, the urgency, the attempted access. If future development plans depended on assumptions about that corridor, then any challenge to those assumptions threatened far more than routine maintenance. The next morning, I received a call from Martin. His voice sounded measured as always. He had reviewed additional engineering records overnight. Several archived files had been located. Some matched the reference numbers from the courthouse documents. Others connected directly to equipment identifiers found along the ranch. We agreed to meet later that afternoon. The day passed slowly. I spent the morning organizing records into categories: easements, surveys, engineering references, inspection records, HOA correspondence. The stack kept growing. By lunchtime, my dining table looked more like a project office than a home. Around 2 o'clock, Martin arrived carrying another folder. We spread documents across the table. Sunlight streamed through the windows and illuminated the pages. Dust floated through the air. For the next hour, we compared records line by line. Several findings reinforced what we already suspected. Then Martin opened one engineering report I had never seen before. The report contained infrastructure dependency diagrams. He placed the page in front of me. Thin lines connected systems across Cedar Hollow. Gate controls, street lighting, clubhouse facilities, security monitoring equipment, irrigation systems, common area electrical service. The diagram looked like a spider web. Nearly every major connection flowed back toward the corridor crossing my ranch. Martin tapped the page quietly. "This is why the location matters," he said. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The scale of it was becoming impossible to ignore. Later that evening, community discussion began spreading faster. Residents were sharing questions online. Some wanted answers. Others wanted documentation. A few defended Diane completely. But the conversation had changed. People were no longer debating whether the corridor existed. They were debating who actually controlled access to it. As the sun disappeared beyond the hills, another email appeared in my inbox. This one came directly from Diane. The email from Diane arrived just after sunset. The subject line contained only 3 words. Request for meeting. I opened it while sitting at the dining table surrounded by maps, photographs, engineering reports, and survey records. Outside, the last orange light faded behind the hills. Inside, the room felt unusually quiet. Diane's message was different from the previous ones. The legal language was gone. The demands were gone. The deadlines were gone. Instead, she proposed a private discussion at the Cedar Hollow Clubhouse the following evening. No attorneys. No contractors. No board members. Just a conversation. I read the email twice. Then a third time. The change in tone stood out immediately. For weeks, every communication had pushed harder. Now the pressure had shifted. That alone told me something had changed. The next morning brought more signs. Several residents emailed me directly. Some asked polite questions. Others shared photographs from old community meetings. One resident forwarded archived newsletters discussing future infrastructure planning. Another shared screenshots of board presentations dating back years. I spent hours reviewing everything. Certain themes appeared repeatedly. Expansion, growth, development, long-term planning. The utility corridor appeared again and again in supporting diagrams. Sometimes it was highlighted. Sometimes it was barely visible. Yet it was always there. Around noon, Martin called. His voice carried the same steady professionalism as before. He had completed another review of engineering records. Additional archive files had surfaced overnight. Several referenced infrastructure dependencies extending beyond the current neighborhood footprint. That detail caught my attention. How far beyond? I asked. A brief pause followed. Far enough to matter. That answer stayed with me long after the call ended. Later that afternoon, I drove towards Cedar Hollow for the first time since inheriting the ranch. The security gate stood beneath neatly maintained landscaping. Decorative stone walls lined the entrance. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across bright green grass. Everything looked organized, predictable, controlled. Residents walked dogs along the sidewalks. Golf carts moved quietly through the streets. Children rode bicycles near the clubhouse. Looking around, it was easy to understand why most homeowners never questioned the systems supporting daily life. Infrastructure remained invisible until someone challenged assumptions about it. The clubhouse stood near the center of the community. Large windows reflected the afternoon sun. Diane was already waiting when I arrived. She sat alone at a conference table overlooking the pool area. No attorneys. No board members. Just as promised. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The soft sound of pool pumps hummed somewhere outside. Finally, Diane folded her hands together. "This has become larger than I expected," she said. It was the most honest statement I had heard from her. The conversation that followed remained civil, careful, measured. Diane acknowledged that questions had emerged regarding historical records. She acknowledged that residents were demanding answers. She acknowledged that outside consultants were reviewing documentation. Yet she avoided discussing ownership directly. Every time the conversation approached that subject, she redirected toward community interests and future planning. That pattern became impossible to ignore. Then she said something unexpected. A development proposal had been under consideration for years. Additional housing, expanded facilities, new community services. Several preliminary plans depended on assumptions regarding corridor access and infrastructure placement. There it was. Not a full admission, not a confession, just enough information to connect another piece of the puzzle. The meeting ended shortly before sunset. As I walked toward the parking lot, warm air carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the property. Residents gathered near the clubhouse patio. Conversations drifted through the evening light. Everything looked normal. Yet beneath that appearance, major questions remained unanswered. I climbed into my truck and checked my phone before leaving. A new message had arrived from Martin. Attached was a document I had been trying to locate since the beginning. The archived engineering report was finally available. The first page alone changed everything. The first page of the engineering report carried a classification stamp from nearly a decade earlier. I sat in my truck beneath the fading evening light and read every line before starting the engine. The report was not written for homeowners. It was not written for HOA boards. It was written for utility planners. The language was technical, precise, unemotional. Yet one conclusion appeared repeatedly throughout the document. The corridor crossing my ranch. had been designated as critical infrastructure for future expansion scenarios. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I drove home. Darkness settled across the hills during the trip back. Headlights swept across fence posts and cattle guards. The utility poles appeared beside the road like silent witnesses. By the time I reached the ranch house, a cool wind had begun moving across the pasture. I carried the report inside and spread it across the dining table beside the maps and surveys. The first page was important. The later pages were even more revealing. Detailed diagrams showed projected service growth, future demand estimates, infrastructure upgrades, distribution capacity planning. Every section pointed toward the same reality. Long-term expansion plans depended on continued access through the corridor. Around midnight, I finally leaned back in my chair. The house was completely silent. Then my phone buzzed. A notification from Cedar Hollow's community forum appeared on the screen. Residents were openly discussing the situation now. Some questioned the board's handling of records. Others demanded transparency. Several wanted an independent review. The conversation had moved beyond private meetings. That shift mattered. The next morning brought another surprise. Martin called before 8 o'clock. His voice sounded more direct than usual. The utility company had scheduled an internal review meeting. Engineers, record specialists, infrastructure planners. Multiple departments would be participating. That was unusual. Large organizations rarely assemble teams unless the issue carries significance. We agreed to meet beforehand and compare notes. By late morning, we were seated in a small conference room at a regional utility office. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished tables. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air. Martin arrived carrying several folders. Another engineer joined us. Then a records supervisor entered. Within minutes, the table filled with maps and technical documents. The discussion remained professional, calm, methodical. Yet the more records they reviewed, the more attention the corridor received. One engineer highlighted infrastructure dependencies. Another referenced archived planning studies. A records specialist verified easement revisions. Piece after piece aligned with information I had already collected. No single document settled everything. Together, however, they painted a remarkably consistent picture. During a short break, I stepped outside. Warm sunlight reflected from parked vehicles in the lot. My phone immediately filled with new messages. Several Cedar Hollow residents had learned about an upcoming HOA board meeting. Attendance was expected to be unusually high. Questions were spreading faster than answers. When the review session resumed, the records supervisor presented something nobody expected: a historical file index. The index itself was ordinary. One entry was not. The entry referenced a supplemental planning document attached to the engineering report years earlier. Nobody in the room had seen it before. The supervisor requested retrieval immediately. For several minutes, everyone waited. Computer screens glowed across the conference room. Keyboards clicked softly. Then the document appeared. The room grew noticeably quieter. The supplemental file did not create a final answer. It did something almost as important. It confirmed that future development assumptions had been built upon access arrangements rather than ownership claims. That distinction changed the tone of the entire discussion. Suddenly, the questions residents were asking seemed far more reasonable. By late afternoon, the review concluded. No final decisions were announced. No dramatic declarations were made. But as people gathered their folders, I noticed something important. Nobody was talking about assumptions anymore. They were talking about documentation. And documentation has a way of changing everything. Then Martin received a message that made him stop walking. Martin stopped beside his truck and stared at the screen for several seconds. The parking lot around us was quiet except for distant traffic and the low hum of air conditioning units mounted on the utility building. Late afternoon sunlight reflected from the windshield. I watched his expression change. Not dramatically, just enough to tell me the message mattered. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up. The company scheduled a formal community briefing. That caught my attention immediately. Throughout the entire situation, the utility company had been careful, measured. Internal reviews were one thing. Public briefings were something else entirely. Martin explained that senior infrastructure managers wanted to address growing questions from residents and local stakeholders. The meeting would take place in Cedar Hollow within days. Word traveled quickly. By the time I returned to the ranch, emails were already circulating among residents. Some were optimistic. Others sounded worried. The uncertainty was spreading faster than any official statement. That evening I sat on the porch watching the sun disappear beyond the western ridge. Warm air moved across the pasture. Utility poles stretched toward the horizon in long silhouettes. The corridor looked unchanged, calm, ordinary. Yet almost every conversation in Cedar Hollow now seemed connected to it. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Residents wanted answers. Reporters from a local community newsletter wanted comments. Even neighboring landowners had started asking questions. The issue had grown beyond a disagreement between a ranch owner and an HOA board. Around 9 o'clock, another message arrived. This one included the agenda for the upcoming community briefing. Infrastructure review. Historical documentation summary. Future planning considerations. Access agreements. Those words stood out. Future planning considerations. I remembered the development maps, the expansion proposals, the engineering projections. Every path seemed to lead back to the same place. The next morning I drove through the ranch before sunrise. Mist drifted above the creek crossing. Birds moved through the cedar trees. The transformer station stood silent except for its steady electrical hum. I stopped near the fence and looked across the corridor. Fresh dew covered the grass. The entire dispute felt strangely distant from the landscape itself. The land had not changed. The poles had not changed. The records had simply forced people to examine assumptions they had accepted for years. Later that day, another development surfaced. Several Cedar Hollow residents organized an informal gathering at the clubhouse. They wanted transparency before the official briefing. Attendance exceeded expectations. Photographs appeared online within hours. Folding chairs filled the meeting room. Residents stood along walls and near doorways. Questions dominated the discussion. Who controlled maintenance access? What did the engineering records actually show? Why were historical documents inconsistent with HOA presentations? People wanted specifics now, not slogans, not assumptions. Documentation. That shift continued gaining momentum. By evening, Diane issued a written statement to residents. The tone was careful, professional. She emphasized cooperation and ongoing reviews. She promised additional information after the utility company's briefing. Reading between the lines, it felt very different from the certainty she projected that first morning beside the transformer fence. I printed the statement and added it to the growing stack of records on my dining table. The pile had become almost absurd. Surveys, easements, engineering reports, emails, photographs, meeting notices. Every document represented another piece of the story. Near midnight, Martin called again. He sounded tired but focused. The company had completed one final records review. Additional archived correspondence had been located. Not engineering diagrams, not maps, correspondence. Internal communications connected to the corridor's planning history. Those records would be discussed during the briefing. That detail immediately grabbed my attention. Maps explain infrastructure. Correspondence explains decisions. Sometimes the second matters more than the first. After the call ended, I stepped outside. Moonlight stretched across the pasture. The utility corridor disappeared into darkness beyond the ridge. Everything was quiet. Then I noticed the first briefing materials had already been distributed. The briefing materials appeared online before sunrise. I opened them while sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee and a stack of records spread across the wood surface. Pale morning light filtered through the windows. Outside, fog hung low over the pasture. Inside, the only sound came from the ticking wall clock. The packet itself was not dramatic. It contained infrastructure summaries, historical timelines, and community planning notes. Yet one section immediately stood out. The utility company had included excerpts from archived correspondence discovered during the final records review. That was new, very new. I read every page carefully. Several letters dated back years. Some involved engineers. Others involved planners and consultants. The language remained professional throughout. Still, a pattern emerged. The corridor was consistently discussed as infrastructure operating under documented access arrangements. Never as community-owned property. Never as HOA-controlled infrastructure. The distinction appeared repeatedly. That mattered more than any single opinion. By mid-morning, the Cedar Hollow clubhouse parking lot was already filling with vehicles. Residents arrived early. Conversations started before the briefing even began. Small groups gathered near sidewalks and landscaping beds. Some carried printed copies of documents. Others compared notes on phones and tablets. The atmosphere felt different from anything I had seen before. Less emotional, more investigative. People wanted facts. Inside the clubhouse, rows of chairs faced a projection screen. Utility representatives organized presentation materials near the front. Engineers reviewed notes. Community members found seats. Diane sat near the front row speaking quietly with several board members. She looked composed, professional. Yet there was a noticeable difference from our first encounter beside the transformer station. Certainty had been replaced by caution. The briefing began shortly after noon. A senior utility manager opened the session. His presentation remained calm and methodical. Historical records were reviewed first, then infrastructure maps, then engineering summaries. Every section reinforced the same message. The corridor was important, extremely important, more important than most residents realized. Questions followed, lots of them. Homeowners asked about maintenance responsibilities, future planning assumptions, infrastructure dependencies, access agreements. The answers remained grounded in documentation, not speculation, not opinion, documentation. Martin spoke briefly about engineering findings. He avoided dramatic conclusions. That was his style. Instead, he explained how records, surveys, infrastructure identifiers, and archived reports aligned, piece by piece, step by step. The room stayed remarkably quiet while he spoke. Then the archived correspondence appeared on the screen. Several letters discussed long-term planning assumptions connected to future growth scenarios. One paragraph drew immediate attention. It referenced continued access coordination with land ownership interests, not ownership transfer, not community control, access coordination. The distinction landed heavily across the room. I could feel it. Residents exchanged glances. Notes were written. Screenshots were taken. The conversation had reached a different stage now. People were no longer debating rumors. They were evaluating evidence. The briefing lasted nearly 3 hours. By the end, nobody had delivered a dramatic declaration. No one stood up and announced a winner. Real situations rarely work that way. Instead, something more significant happened. The framework of the discussion changed completely. Assumptions gave way to records. Narratives gave way to documentation. As people left the clubhouse, conversations continued across the parking lot. Small groups formed near vehicles. Questions persisted, but the tone felt different. More informed, more grounded. Later that evening, after returning to the ranch, I sat on the porch watching sunset settle across the hills. The corridor stretched through the pasture exactly as it always had. The transformer station hummed in the distance. Wind moved gently through the grass. My phone buzzed once. Then again, a new message had arrived from the utility company. Attached was a proposed framework for future access negotiations. One section immediately caught my attention. One section of the proposed framework addressed something nobody had discussed publicly until that moment. Long-term access coordination. I read the paragraph twice while sitting on the porch. The evening sky glowed orange beyond the western ridge. Wind moved gently through the pasture. The transformer station hummed in the distance, steady and unchanged. Yet everything around it had changed. The framework recognized documented infrastructure needs. It recognized historical easement rights. It recognized land ownership boundaries. Most importantly, it proposed a formal structure that replaced assumptions with clearly defined agreements. For the first time since the dispute began, every major party seemed to be working from the same set of facts. The following week brought a series of meetings. Utility representatives participated. Legal advisors reviewed records. Survey data was verified one final time. The atmosphere felt completely different from those first days beside the transformer fence. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just documents, maps, engineering reports, and verified records. That was where the real answers had always been. Diane attended several sessions. She remained professional throughout. The certainty that defined our first encounter had disappeared. In its place was a more cautious approach focused on resolution rather than control. Residents followed developments closely. Community discussions continued online and at neighborhood gatherings. The difference now was that people had access to information. Verified information. The rumors gradually faded. Documentation replaced speculation. Several weeks later, final agreements were completed. Utility maintenance procedures were clarified. Access routes were formally documented. Future coordination requirements were established. Infrastructure planning assumptions were updated to reflect actual records rather than inherited beliefs. The process was not dramatic. It was something better. It was accurate. One afternoon, Martin visited the ranch one last time. We stood near the transformer station while warm sunlight stretched across the grass. The same fence remained in place. The same poles crossed the pasture. The same wires carried power toward Cedar Hollow. Everything looked exactly as it had on the morning this story began. Yet the understanding behind it was completely different. Martin looked toward the corridor and smiled slightly. Amazing what happens when people read the records. I laughed. He was right. The entire conflict had started because assumptions survived longer than documentation. After he left, I walked the service road alone. Grass brushed against my boots. The scent of cedar drifted through the air. Survey markers remained exactly where they had always been. Quiet. Ignored. Waiting for someone to notice them. Near the creek crossing, I stopped beside the utility cabinet that had first connected so many pieces together. Sunlight reflected from the metal surface. Water moved gently beneath the bridge nearby. The ranch felt peaceful again. A few days later, Cedar Hollow held a community meeting focused on future planning. Attendance was high. Residents asked thoughtful questions. Utility representatives answered them. The conversation centered on transparency, documentation, and cooperation. Watching from the back of the room, I realized how much had changed. The issue was never really about a fence, a transformer station, or even a corridor. It was about what happens when people stop accepting assumptions and start following evidence. Eventually, the meeting ended. Residents headed home. The parking lot emptied. The clubhouse lights dimmed. Life moved forward. Back at the ranch, sunset painted the hills gold. Utility poles cast long shadows across the pasture. The corridor stretched toward the horizon exactly as it always had. I stood beside the fence and listened to the familiar hum from the equipment beyond it. The sound no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a reminder. Records matter. Boundaries matter. Facts matter. And when patience is combined with documentation, truth usually has a way of finding daylight. The corridor never changed, but the story around it did.